And we're thrilled today to have with us Corinne Zupko, or Zupko. Got it right this time. Corinne has written a book, and I'm excited to be able to share an interview with Corinne because it's a very practical set of tools for managing anxiety, or you might say healing or curing anxiety. And so Corinne is a specialist in education. She has an LPC. She's the author of the best-selling and 3-time award-winning book, From Anxiety to Love, A Radical New Approach for Letting Go of Fear and Finding Lasting Peace, published by New World Library in 2018. Corinne Zupko was diagnosed with her first anxiety disorder at a very young age and struggled with debilitating anxiety for nearly 3 decades. Determined not to let anxiety run her life, she dove into the living principles of the psychological and spiritual text, A Course in Miracles. With the Course and mindfulness meditation as tools on her journey, she has found inner peace to be unstoppable and now teaches others to discover it in themselves. Corinne is a keynote speaker, adjunct professor of counselor education at the College of New Jersey, licensed counselor, board-certified coach, and teaches weekly mindfulness meditation classes at Bank of America. You can sign up for her free 3-part video crash course on undoing anxiety with A Course in Miracles at the following website, FromAnxietyToLove.com/crash course. So, Corinne, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Dr. Tim, thank you so much for having me. I am just so honored and thrilled to be here. I'm really inspired by the work that you're doing in the world, you and Dr. Michael Rice and everybody on the show.
Well, thank you. I'm very, very pleased that somewhere along the line we're creating a network of people who go out and read other books and then come back and say, hey, have you heard about this? Because that's how I found out about your work. One of the people who listens to our show on a regular basis mentioned you, and I have such high regard for that person's opinion that I immediately bought the book, and here we are. I'm thrilled to be able to share your work with our audience, as I said, because it's so practical. So how did you get on this path?
Well, that's a great question. So this path, I would say, found me, although I did do some searching. So as you shared in my bio, I have had quite an extensive history of multiple psychiatric diagnoses in the anxiety disorder realm. And my first anxiety disorder diagnosis came at a very young age. I was around 2 years old, maybe 1.5, somewhere around there. And that was separation anxiety disorder. My mother could not leave a room, even in our own house, without me screaming my head off for the first, I think it may have been through like late elementary school, where I couldn't take art classes because I couldn't, although I did take art classes, she had to be there, is my point. Like, I could not do anything unless she was there with me. So that was my rocky start in the anxiety sphere. And, you know, as I grew, I developed phobias as a child, but I'm sure, as you know, with your background in psychology, that the college years are a time when mental health issues surface for a lot of people, you know, that age range around that time. And I was no exception. So my sophomore year, I remember it was finals week of the fall semester. So it was around, you know, maybe mid-December. I learned that a student who I didn't know died very suddenly of meningitis. And health fears were like my number one anxiety trigger. Lots of my phobias when I was younger was surrounding being afraid of getting sick, I would be really nervous, like going to a restaurant because I was afraid of overeating and getting a bellyache. Every time I felt a physical pain, I'd ask my mom if I was going to die. Like I really, really had a high amount of fear surrounding sickness and death. And when I was in college and this happened, I remember that day just feeling this flood of fear when I learned that he suddenly passed. And I calmed myself down enough, kind of talked myself through it to get through the day, went to bed. And that night, I remember waking up feeling as if I had just been punched in the stomach. And I was punched in the stomach by a flood of stress hormones. It was my first panic attack, only at that time I didn't know what was happening. I was gasping for air. My heart was racing. It felt like it was going to explode. I was shaking. I was sweating. And it was just this feeling that the world was just sort of crashing in on me, and it just felt like my death was imminent, that I was just going to die. And I remember getting out of my bunk bed. I was on the top bunk, and my knees could barely support my body weight as I sort of shakily, climbed my way down the bunk bed. And back then we didn't have cell phones, so I grabbed my campus phone in our room and stretched the wire out into the bathroom, hoping not to wake any of my suite mates. And my mom picked up the phone, which was miraculous because it was 3 a.m., and she sleeps like I do. We both sleep with earplugs and like a white noisemaker and anything to blot out noise. But through all of that, she heard the phone ring at 3 a.m. I think something in her just knew that she was needed. And together we figured out I was having a panic attack, and she kind of talked me through it. And at that time, she had already begun a spiritual pathway, and she was into this weird thing called A Course in Miracles that I wanted nothing to do with. What do, when you're a loving parent and you are trying to give something to your child that you think is helpful, what happens often? But we're like, no, I don't want that. We resist. And that's exactly what I had done up until this point whenever she tried to talk to me about anything remotely spiritual. However, at this time when, I was on the cold tile floor in my suite bathroom, feeling like this was it, that I was going to die and I was never going to come out of this, as we talked, my mom said to me, she said, Corinne, I know you haven't wanted to talk about this before, but there's this book that I study called A Course in Miracles, and it's all about the finding and the keeping of that state of peace. Would you be interested? And at that point, which was my rock bottom, I said, yes, I will try absolutely anything, bring it on. I think I went home that very next, it was within a couple days, I pushed my way through the final exams that I had to take, and my mom gave me my very first copy of A Course in Miracles, and I remember opening the book and reading the first few lines, which says, nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. And I literally was like, huh? I had no idea what that meant. But the best way that I can describe it is that it felt like a light went on in my heart. There was something in me that stirred, that said, yes, this is your pathway. You're going to find the answers that you need. This is going to help you. And that was back in 1996. I've never put the book down since. I found that it just has layers and layers of understanding and experience, and it just continues to deepen for me. So it was really the depths of anxiety that brought me to this path. And I imagine for many of us, we come to doing deep inner work like this because of pain. We don't tend to crack open a text like this unless there's some kind of motivation, where we're searching, we're trying to find something. So in my journey, it was really this intense anxiety that brought me to this pathway. And therefore, and I can't believe, if the younger me could hear me saying this now, she'd be like, what, are you crazy? But I'm grateful for the anxiety. I'm grateful for all of the difficult experiences, gosh, and I mean, there were multiple diagnoses. There wasn't just separation anxiety. There was generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder. I'm grateful for all of it because that fearful intensity, those feelings, I allowed those feelings to motivate me to dive into this work more deeply than I would have otherwise. So I'm grateful for everything that I've been through, and of course I'm grateful to be on the other side. Oh, so that's a bit. That's the beginning of my journey.
Well, that's desperation is quite the motivator for those of us stubborn humans. Yeah, yeah, and of course, the way you've turned this into a very practical set of tools intrigues me. There was clearly some innate genius in there, maybe underlying all of the anxiety, but you've done a marvelous job with this book. And one of the things I like about it is how it lays out so much step by step. And not every chapter, but many of the chapters have, here's something to meditate on, here's something to journal on, here's a set of mantra targets for the day. How did you choose that, the format for your book?
Well, you're really hitting on the key point about this being practical. When you're in the thick of something really difficult, you need to know what to do. You need those steps. You need that breakdown of, what exactly I'm lost in this. Help me out. What do I do? So my motivation with the format was to make A Course in Miracles accessible, to make the tools things that you can read and easily understand, because as I expressed in my story, I had no comprehension for about, I'd say, as I was reading the Course and studying the Course, maybe 15% of the message was going in. I wasn't getting all of it just because it took some time and I wasn't, ready early on. But I really wanted this book to break it down in a way that anybody, whether you're familiar with A Course in Miracles or not, could pick up the book, apply the tools, and see results, because it's really the results piece that I'm focused on, because I know how uncomfortable and painful anxiety is. So all of the steps, all of the tools, the mind-straightening mantras that you mentioned, the journal prompts, the meditations, these were all things that I used as I dove into the Course. A lot of it did come from a place of inspiration, but I took 6 years to write this book, so I was not one of those individuals who set out to be an author. What happened was that I went through another very debilitating episode of anxiety in 2009, so 10 years ago, and that was actually a turning point for me in my spiritual growth, because that's when I really started applying and living this work. And as I did that, I started finding that the anxiety was just shedding. Like it was as if, like a snake sheds its old skin. It was as if it just started falling away. And I knew I had to write down the specific things that were helping me. So literally, as I thought, as a mantra came to me, as a helpful quote struck my heart as I was studying, I would write it down, and I found that, like, okay, I think I'm writing a book. I think it's all coming together into this format, because I just had this inner drive to put it down on paper, the exact things that were helpful to me. So that's really, the format really came out of my own experiences and my desire to make this very accessible to others, because, like I said, I know how uncomfortable and painful the experience of anxiety can be.
Well, yeah, you said at one point in the book that my panic attacks used to happen spontaneously during the day. They woke me up at night and sometimes lasted, take a breath everybody, 2 weeks at a time. The dry heaves, stomach spasms, and trouble eating were evidence from the ego that I was losing my mind to anxiety. But I refused to lose hope of recovery. So congratulations for refusing and for compiling this book, because it has succeeded, in my humble opinion, of being practical. One of the things about it is so often when people run into the Course in Miracles, they are stuck on the words and find it difficult to read because it uses many different concepts without always clarifying. And you've done this work here in this book of laying out the Course quotes in the context of your work so that they become far more understandable, at least to my eye, with my limited knowledge of the Course. I have far more experience with the Way of Mastery, but the concepts are the same. Mm-hmm. And so congratulations for that. There's so much in the book. One of the things is in your third chapter, you talk about 2 choices and 2 voices. Can you say a little bit about that?
Definitely. So we have, the way that I think about this, and this is, what the Course teaches, is that we can think about having 2 thought systems in our mind. One thought system is the ego-based, fearful thought system. This is the thought system that tells us that we're just this limited body. It's the thought system that's, where all conflict comes from, where all difficulty comes from, that clashing, that we might feel with other people when we feel like somebody has just attacked us and how we need to defend and we need to attack back and be right and, prove our innocence. This is that fear-based thought system that is fabric to the external world that we see. And it's out of this fear-based thought system that's in our minds that is the cause of difficulties when we're listening to it, when we're believing in it, when we're giving it our energy. The good news is that we have another thought system in our mind that is accessible, that is right here always, and it's a thought system based on love. It's who we are. It is what we are meant to express in this world. It's how we're meant to live. It's how we're meant to be. And the trouble is that this fearful thought system is really tempting. Like it's got a lot of charge to it, like when something kicks up, it just seems like it can take over. And this loving thought system is always there, but it's still, it's quiet, it's conflict-free. There's no drama there. And so these 2 voices that are in our minds, this voice of fear, this voice of love, or 2 thought systems really, give us in every moment a choice. And we have that choice. Where are we going to pump our belief and our energy? Are we going to pump our belief and our energy into the fearful thought system and keep the difficulty, the conflict, the drama going? Or are we going to make a new choice to step out of that, to release that voice, and choose again this other thought system, this voice of love? And so as we listen to this voice of love, we find, again, that experiences can come through that teach us that this is who we are, this is how we're meant to live, this is our happiness. Part of our problem is that we often think that the things in the fearful thought system make us happy. Like, a thing can somehow satisfy us, like a car, or the right house, or the right partner. Where this loving thought system is saying, no, everything you need, your joy, your happiness, your completion, your innocence is inside you now. That's already here. That's already true. So it becomes a moment-to-moment practice in noticing, where is my mind? Am I pumping belief? Am I fueling thoughts of fear? Or am I going to make a different choice and choose a thought system based on love? So that is our choice point always between fear and love.
Well, and right here in the third chapter, you say, in the twisted theme park that is this earthly realm, dream figures utterly convince us of our separation from one another. And that reminds me of the quote by Bill Hicks, like life is a ride at an amusement park. Are you familiar with that?
I have not heard that before. No.
Well, go ahead and look that up. I've read it on the show several times, but you'll find it delightful. And in the end, he says,
great.
it is it's simply a choice between fear and love.
Mm-hmm.
And the eyes of fear want you to put bigger locks on your doors, buy guns, and close yourself off. And the eyes of love instead see us all as one. So, if you just search for Bill Hicks, "Life is a Ride," you'll get that. The other thing, as I mentioned here, after you mention the amusement park, you bring in the quote from A Course in Miracles: "The ego always speaks first and loudest." So, what was one of the most, or is one of the most useful things you do to turn down the volume on the ego and turn up the volume on what you call your inner therapist?
I love that question. So I would say the number one thing to do, since the ego always speaks loudest and first, is to pause. So our problem often is that the ego, that fear reaction kicks up inside, and we have a knee-jerk response to it. We act from that spot, from that trigger. And the most practical thing that I do in those moments is to pause, to breathe, and to notice what's happening. We have to employ what I like referring to as radical honesty, being really honest with ourselves that, okay, I'm feeling really hooked right now. This situation is really making me angry, and I want to lash out. That's radical honesty, is to name it like it is. So one of the most important things is to pause, to breathe, to even, like I just did, name what's going on. From, I guess it's neuropsychology, they have that expression, name it to tame it, where as we name what's happening, as we put a word to our emotions, that's been shown to decrease our amygdala firing. So if we can name what's happening, that can open that space up to pause. So that's, I would say, one of the first things to do. In terms of turning down the volume on the ego and increasing the volume on your inner therapist, I will just first begin by saying that the inner therapist is a term that we can use many different words to describe the same thing. When I'm talking about your inner therapist, I'm referring to the inner part of you that knows the truth, that knows that you are loved. The inner therapist is our bridge, our link to our source. The inner therapist, part of our mind, knows the source. It knows the truth. So this part of our mind, we could conceptualize it as outside the fearful thought system. So the fearful thought system is like a closed loop, and it's designed that way. It's designed to just keep the ego garbage going. If the inner therapist is outside of that closed loop, the only way to tap into it is to ask, to ask for help, to have that pause and to say, hey, there's got to be another way that opens up that closed loop and brings in our awareness of our inner therapist. It allows us to access this loving thought system in our mind. So in terms of then how to increase the voice of our inner therapist, to me, that really comes through a moment-to-moment willingness. This is another practical term here, is to be willing, again, no matter what is happening, to pause and ask. So our willingness is everything. It's the precursor for change. It's how we connect with our inner therapist. Our willingness to see whatever is happening in our world differently is that doorway to change. So the other practical piece of increasing the volume of the inner therapist is to continually, on a moment-to-moment basis, be willing. I'll even dive into an actual practice that I have in the book, and this practice is about tuning into your body. So this actually comes out of the work of a spiritual teacher. His name is John Mark Stroud, and I loved this so much I had to include it. When that ego voice is kicking up, you can imagine that it's on its channel. So let's step back for a moment and visualize how radios used to look in the olden days when they had knobs and needles, and you had to turn the knob to fine-tune the needle to tune in to a radio station. So you wouldn't turn the radio to a country music station and then get mad that that station is playing country music when you want to hear hip-hop. What would you do? You would just change the radio station. You would tune into a different frequency if you wanted to hear hip-hop, and that's how you would then hear hip-hop. So with the voice of our inner therapist, with increasing the volume with our inner therapist, it's about learning how to tune into a different channel. The channel of the ego, of that fear voice, in my experience, often comes through that chatterbox, that monkey mind, those racing thoughts, that mind that just doesn't feel settled or quiet. And sometimes I also have like a physical, maybe feeling in my chest of like urgency. Those are ego channels for me. If I'm going to tune into the voice of my inner therapist, I'm going to tune into a different channel. So where can I bring my attention to in my body to tune into that different channel? Because we experience everything in these bodies. So where can I bring my attention to? So for me, my feeling of connecting with my inner therapist comes from like a deep place in my core. It's this feeling that feels like it's resonating almost. There's a lightness. And in the book, I walk us through a meditation where you basically ask, with your eyes closed, for your inner therapist to direct your attention to a place in your body where you can most easily tune into that voice, that guidance. So when I'm triggered in the moment, and I'm noticing those familiar signals, the red flag of the racing thoughts, the urgency, oh my gosh, I have to respond, I'll pause and I'll bring my attention instead to that place that I know I experience that voice in my core, and I'll stay with that. I'll listen to that until something comes through. So it might mean having to not respond to a text or an email or a phone call right away in order to give myself that space. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I hear so much in what you're saying that sounds like excerpts from Dr. Michael Rice's lectures, that the idea of tuning in to a different energy, and it's always there. The ancient Aramaic word for prayer can be validly interpreted as to set a trap for God. And so, as Michael Rice talks from that definition in some of his lectures, he talks about the analogy of the radio dial. And Guy Finley in some of his work talks about getting quiet enough, pushing the distractions out, and he actually has a story where somebody's supposed to be listening for a rescue signal, but instead they're just surfing the dial looking for anything to keep them busy and distracted. So it makes very good sense. There's another story you have that I wanted to bring up. I want to make sure I don't forget this. It has to do with, and your phrase, I believe, is calling forth witnesses to love, and it had to do with going for blood tests. Now, I don't know if this was at a time before you had mastered some of the constant fear of disease or not. But can you tell us a little bit about that?
I'm so glad you brought that story up, because that was really one of the pivotal learning experiences in my development of trust. So this definitely was earlier in the game, but still I had years of working the course under my belt at this time. And as I've said already, my biggest triggers have always been health stuff. So I used to, feel something that was a little off with my body and forget, like, oh, maybe you just have indigestion. I'd go to the worst case scenario, like immediately. Like my mind would go from 0 to 100. I was dying. It was, X, Y, or Z disease. And if I heard about the latest outbreak of something on the news, that would always spike my fear. So I had a lot of baggage and triggers surrounding illness and sickness. So this story is that I was having a physical symptom that I have always had. It wasn't a big deal. It didn't amount to anything, but there was just a day when I decided to start worrying about it, which is so, part of the anxiety pattern. And so I went to a doctor to get this symptom investigated, even though it had always been there, literally probably since the day I was born. And when I was at this doctor's office, they were drawing blood, and I'm sorry for anybody who has, needle anxiety. I will not give you details, I promise. But just to hear me out, because this is a pretty powerful experience. So I'm getting the lab work done, and the nurse is chatting with me, and she asks me why I'm there at the doctor's office. And I tell her, and she looks at me, and she goes, well, that's not good. And, that made me uncomfortable, and I got a little defensive, and I was like, well, I've had this symptom my whole life. And she goes, well, that's not good. And then she looks at me, and she goes, don't you pass out on me. So guess what I did? I, got that vasovagal pass-out response, and they had to put my feet up, and they brought me juice and gummy worms. And I could have gone down the road of blame, of pointing the finger that nurse was the cause of why my anxiety spiked, that she's a lousy nurse, she was insensitive, she didn't say good things, et cetera, et cetera. I could have gone there. But at this point in time, I had been working with this material for long enough where I knew that the belief, the thought that was already in my mind was a thought of fear. It was a thought that, oh my gosh, there might be something wrong with me, I'm scared. That was the thought that needed to be removed. That was the thought that was driving the whole experience. And so she showed up. She was a witness for fear. She agreed to play that role to strengthen my fear, because I had this thought of fear in my mind, and it was like I was looking for witnesses to affirm my fear, and she agreed to play that role. So fast forward, I'm in the doctor's office still, but now I'm better, and I'm in with the doctor. What does he do? But he says, okay, here you go. Here's a prescription. You need to go get more lab work done. We're going to do a whole extensive, I think I had every lab test under the sun. So that, was even, I had to go to a hospital to get these additional lab tests done because they were so involved. And hospitals were even a bigger trigger for me than doctor's offices. I was terrified of them. So in my head, I was like, oh, great. I just went through this experience with this nurse, and now I have to go to a hospital and, go get these labs done again. But what I decided, knowing what I knew, knowing that I chose to look at it, that I called that witness for fear forward because of the belief that was already in my mind, which was a belief of fear, a belief that, I've got to be finding out what's wrong with me, or a belief simply that there was something wrong. I went to this hospital, and I was still very nervous. So even though I wanted to do this experience differently this time, I was still nervous. But what I kept saying to myself was, I want to call forth witnesses for love. I want to call forth witnesses for love. I essentially was saying, I want that belief in wholeness and in love to be in my focus, to be in my awareness. That's the belief that I want to take over, that fear belief. And therefore, I want witnesses for love in my experience to show up to reinforce this new thought in my mind. Not that love is a new thought, it's always there, but that's that's how I conceptualized it. So I went into this outpatient lab, still nervous but determined to call forth witnesses for love. And as I walked in, behind the desk was the mom of one of my college roommates, and I was so happy to see her. I had no idea that she worked there, and I thought she was the receptionist because she was sitting at the front desk. Without my asking, she got up and she walked me in the back. It turns out she's a nurse, and so she did the lab work, and the whole time we were just chatting about her daughter, my friend's children, her grandchildren. There was no pass-out response. I made it through. But here's the big moment. As I was leaving, I was literally walking out the door, and she said, Corinne, it was a Monday. She said, Corinne, it's really great that you came in today because I never work on Mondays, and I got called in 30 minutes before you showed up. And I still get goosebumps sharing that story because that, to me, was a witness that the power of decision is my own, as A Course in Miracles says. I have that power in me always to decide which thought am I going to fuel, which belief system, which voice am I going to pump my energy and my belief into. And in that experience, which was still anxiety-provoking and, still scary, I still, however, was determined to place my allegiance, to place my faith in that love thought system and love which I am. And she, to me, was a manifestation or evidence that this works. So that was my really, really powerful learning opportunity.
Yeah, I love that story, and I love the idea that, you talk about handing things over to the inner therapist being harder than looking with the inner therapist. Can you say a little bit about how you conceptualize the difference and how you got to that?
Yeah. So basically, in my work, I call on my inner therapist all the time because, like I said, I conceptualize it as outside of the fearful thought system. It is this voice of love in my mind, and this is what I want to be listening to. So whenever I'm going through something challenging, to be a miracle worker, to experience miracles, which are these shifts in perception, which are expressions of love, I need to hand my stuff over to my inner therapist. I need to call on my inner therapist for help. And the way that we think about this is what we're getting to in your question. So I can say, okay, here's my difficulty. Here's my fear. Inner therapist, here you go. I'm tossing this into your hands. I'm releasing it. I'm giving it to you. But what I mean when that can feel hard is how we can then immediately go back into worrying about it. It's like we don't hand it over and let it go. We say, okay, here you go. But then we keep mulling over the fear thought. We keep, trying to problem solve. We keep trying to fix.
You didn't fix it yet, therapist. You didn't. Wait, it's still here.
Exactly. Exactly. Like, I still have it. Like, come on. Like, where are you? Hurry up. And so
Dear Lord, give me patience, but give it to me now.
Give it to me right now. Exactly. So I found. Go on.
Let me just say that as you go to finish this, in this work, Dr. Rice talks about one of the biggest traps of our non-being mind. He talks about your true nature is the being of love, is this energy of creation and form. And then the non-being mind is this ego, etc. And the biggest trap is to try and figure it out. And you go on here to talk about how we're not asked to do the inner therapist's job.
Yes.
We really need to hand it over, but sometimes it's hard to hand it over. And I love that you've come up with this idea all right, I may not be willing to hand it over, but I'm going to look at it with the
Yes.
therapist.
Yes. Thank you for adding that. That's beautiful. Such important points in there that we are not asked to do the inner therapist job. We are asked to do so little. A Course in Miracles says that the ego finds it insulting. We want to do more. So when I feel like handing something over just feels too great because I'm impatient and I'm going to keep worrying about it, I will imagine that my inner therapist is looking at that issue. I'm looking at it with my inner therapist. So I'm not hiding it. I'm not keeping any kind of dark cornerstone. There's nothing lurking in the shadows. I'm literally saying, here's the fear thought. Here's the darkness. I'm willing to look at this with you. And I actually picture a light, love, something beyond me beaming down on this issue as we're looking at it together. Because as we look at it together, that's also where it feels less scary. In my own journey, if I'm trying to look at my own darkness in my mind by myself, like it can be kind of intimidating and feel pretty icky. But when I am imagining that I am looking at this with this higher part of my mind, this true self part of me that is wholly loving and there is no judgment and its job is to heal, then bring it on. I'm not afraid then to look at any of my own stuff, my own ego, my own, darkness or patterns, because I'm looking at it with the light of love. So that just feels easier to look at something with rather than feel like you have this big thing that you have to somehow let go of and hand over.
Well, I love what you just said there. I read your book and made a lot of notes, but I didn't get this image, and it might be in the book, but the way you just said it, of this bright light shining on it, illuminating the issue, and looking at it with the inner therapist, which you talk about very well throughout the book. In the 22nd lesson from The Way of Mastery, it says, the title of the lesson is self-honesty is the greatest act of love. And you bring that home over and over again, that in order to heal, I've got to be really honest with myself about my willingness to heal. And sometimes I say I want to get rid of this thing, but I'm not really willing to change anything about what I'm doing that might actually be creating it. So I love the idea that you have in there about just asking yourself, are you willing to be willing? You back it up a step or two.
That's so key. We really do have to be so honest with ourselves, because if there's any inkling that, no, I don't want to let this go. Like that person was a jerk and I want them to pay. I want them to know that they're wrong. I have to be honest about that, because if I'm not honest about that, I'm just kidding myself and none of this is going to work. So that honesty is key, and I'm so grateful that you brought up that beautiful quote from Way of Mastery, because I completely agree. And this brings up for me the importance, this is something else I talk about in the book, of asking yourself, do you want to heal or do you want to just fix? And what I mean by that, healing is about uprooting and undoing those thoughts of fear in the mind. Fixing is about just wanting to keep everything in the mind as is, but you want the external picture to just be happy and nice. You want the anxiety to go away, you want the relationship difficulty to go away, but you don't want to change anything inside. You don't want to have to look at any of that or, do this work or actually, uproot a belief or a thought in a separate self, which for me is what this journey is all about, is learning that we are not separate from love. We are not separate from one another. Love is literally who we are. And it's in the awakening to that, even just scratching the surface of starting to realize that we are not separate from love, that these issues like anxiety in my experience just falls away. I don't claim to have uprooted that belief in a separate self. I've at least scratched the surface, and what you read earlier about where I used to be, like the panic attacks that lasted 2 weeks, the dry heaving, I went through a difficult episode 10 years ago, like I mentioned, and I am light years from that. Like, I've had moments of feeling like I couldn't make myself have a panic attack if I tried. So the healing for me has been profound because of my commitment to being honest, my willingness to look at the thoughts and beliefs that I'm holding in my mind, and my willingness to uproot, question those, and have those be replaced with love.
Well, as you were saying that, another thing I have highlighted here is that you've quoted Rene Descartes, who said, "If you would be a real seeker after truth, it's necessary that at least once in your life you doubt, as far as possible, all things."
Mm-hmm.
And in this work, we are called over and over to question what our culture trains us to believe. You made me angry, you scared me, you insulted me, you hurt my feelings. And we're called into the direct observation that that's never happened, that this is all an inside job, that every emotion I have is created by the beliefs and thoughts that I pour energy into. And the good news there is I can change it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's that place of empowerment. If we're staying a victim, a passive victim of the external world, how depressing is that? That perhaps satisfies the ego, because that's exactly what the ego wants, is to, place cause outside of ourselves and not look within. But if I can instead say that what I'm seeing out there is a direct cause, is a direct effect, of what's in my mind, I'm now in a place of empowerment because I can choose again. I can now do something about it. So I have found in my own journey that this term radical responsibility, where I'm willing to be responsible for everything that shows up in my experience, it's all showing me something that's in my mind, that is no longer in the slightest bit upsetting or threatening to me. It puts me in that place of empowerment because now I can do something about it. And I'd much rather be empowered than be that passive victim.
Well, and I really am grateful for the way you put these steps together and referenced, the work, A Course in Miracles, that you've referenced. If people get introduced to it through your book, then they can do another whole level of deep dive. But the idea that you have outlined these practical tools and given people what you have found to be useful affirmations and targets for journaling and meditation practices is wonderful. Is there an area, we've got about 10 minutes left, that we haven't even touched on yet that you want to make sure we get into the interview?
Ooh, great question. So I guess I feel moved at this moment just to go back to that idea of not doing the inner therapist job for it, because I feel like that's a really sticky area that we sometimes get so caught up in having to do and wanting to do. I have to do more, or I have to do this right. I want to just revisit that, at least just for a moment, to highlight that again, because I feel like that's so incredibly important in this journey. Now, just like you said, if somebody listening gets introduced to the Course in Miracles through my work and wants more, one of the things that I'll say about what the Course teaches is there are multiple quotes in A Course in Miracles where it uses this three-letter word for, meaning the Holy Spirit, inner therapist, whatever you want to call it, will choose for God for us. this word for shows up over and over again in the book, and I would just glance past that for years, almost like it didn't even register in my mind, and I would just read right past it. And then when I started noticing, and one of the first places that I noticed that word for, in the Foundation for Inner Peace edition, it's page 90. So we, on my study group, have lovingly referred to this as the page 90 prayer. And this prayer, which I'll share, and I actually have this prayer in my book because I found it to be like the perfect reset button. When you're going through something difficult, this is similar. There was a rather twisted cartoon on TV back in the 90s called Ren and Stimpy. Anybody listening might remember. And there was this one episode called Space Madness where Stimpy is not supposed to press this big red button, because if he presses this big red button, it'll just reset everything. It'll start over. It'll, reset the universe and start over from scratch. And I like to say that this page 90 prayer is like that. So it goes, I must have decided wrongly because I am not at peace. So I must have decided wrongly because I am not at peace. There we are in this place of empowerment. I must have decided wrongly because I am not at peace. I made the decision myself, but I can also decide otherwise. So again, I made the decision myself, so I can also decide otherwise. I want to decide otherwise because I want to be at peace. Again, I want to decide otherwise because I want to be at peace. And then it says, I do not feel guilty because the Holy Spirit will undo all the consequences of my wrong decision if I will let him. And I choose to let him by allowing him to decide for God for me. So there it is. I choose to let the Holy Spirit undo the consequences, and I allow the Holy Spirit to choose for God for me. Now, first, I just want to say that the Course does use masculine pronouns. I have heard elsewhere that, I think actually I heard it from Dr. Michael Rice, the Holy Spirit is a feminine energy, and I know that the Hebrew version of A Course in Miracles refers to the Holy Spirit as she, so I absolutely love that. But in that prayer, it's putting us back in that place of empowerment, because I'm the one that must have decided wrongly, and essentially walks us into turning to the Holy Spirit, trusting, not feeling guilty for anything, because guilt is just another ego ploy that the ego will use to keep us in the fearful thought system. And it actually says in that prayer that spirit, that love, will undo the consequences of our wrong decisions. So we have nothing to be guilty for, and we just have to let the Spirit choose for God for me. So that's the piece that I just really wanted to emphasize, is our little part is about being willing. It's about being willing to look at our stuff with Spirit, like we talked about before, imagining that light just beaming down on whatever issue it is. And that's our small part, is to just take the darkness to the light. And then there is that replacement. There's that wiping away. A Course in Miracles calls it atonement. It's that wiping away of fear, the undoing of fear. As that block, that perception, is erased from the mind, what gushes in but the love that's already there, that love that's in us, that's already here in the here and now. We just don't seem aware of it or in touch with it because of the perceptions, the blocks that we've put in place that are fearful, that are sort of covering that. So I hope that that is super clear and makes sense, that our small part is to be willing to take that darkness to the light and to let Spirit do its job, which is to choose for love for us, because we don't, I mean, let's be real. Like if you say, Corinne, choose love, I don't know what that means. Like from my own limited standpoint, how can I possibly know what the most loving response could be in a situation maybe that impacts multiple people? If I'm going to be, do something for one person, that could maybe potentially hurt another. I don't have the big picture perspective. So my small part is to turn to Spirit, let Spirit choose for love for me, and then act based on that guidance, that love that comes through.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly why in each and every worksheet, which is the core of the set of tools Dr. Michael Rice offers, we're asked to cancel all the goals, and just like it says in the Course in Miracles, open a curtain in your practice, put away everything you think you want, your trifling treasures, put away, and leave a clean and open space for the Christ mind to come. Well, that's a part of every worksheet process, getting out of, Dr. Rice says, if you want to heal, you got to be out of your mind.
Yes, I love that.
He also, in one of the things I love that you included in your book is the quote from A Course in Miracles where it says, "Rest in peace is a blessing for the living, not the dead." I love that.
I love that too.
And we're called so often in this work to try to remember that these things are happening for us in life, not to us. And if you've got the kind of tools that you lay out in your book and the body of work that the Course in Miracles and Dr. Michael Rice's work with the Kabbalistic manuscript, which fits beautifully with that, then all these things are possible. Well, I don't know how to thank you other than just say thank you. And is there some place you would direct people to find out more? Do you want to invite people to join you
definitely.
someplace?
I would invite everybody to come over to FromAnxietyToLove.com. That's my website. I do a free Course in Miracles study group every Sunday night. It's a call-in number similar to your radio show where we read A Course in Miracles and talk about it together. I have a podcast, From Anxiety to Love Radio, on iTunes. I have meditation giveaways on my website that you can sign up for and online classes, so I do invite everybody to connect. I am on all social media platforms and probably spend a little too much time there, but I would love to connect with everyone.
Sorry, I just muted myself accidentally. So thank you so much for being here. It is a delight to have you, and I'm glad to have this book in my toolbox for people who have anxiety, and I look forward to your next piece of work, whether it's a book or another project. And please feel free to stay in touch.
Awesome. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart.
Blessings.
Blessings.